Yes, I know it feels like a lifetime since we last saw each other, but I promise it was only 2 weeks. 2 weeks, of course, full of changing nappies and invoking the holy spirits of burping, as my baby boy is officially 1 month old. This is Pospo and BRAINCAST for mostly learning. Last time, we had the chance to explore the extremely common yet equally complex matter of headaches with one of the world-leading experts and one of the 2021 awardees of probably the most prestigious award in our field, the Brain Prize, and our guest, Professor Peter Goadsby. If you missed that, make sure you watch the video on YouTube or indulge my Greek accent by listening the whole session on Spotify. This week, though, we take a virtual flight to Montreal and McGill University, where we find today's guest. And what a guest. He is the director of the McGill Group for Suicide Studies, but also the head of the Depressive Disorders Program. He has, give or take, 515 publications, which is approximately 505 more than myself. He has been cited over 3,000 times. He's among the 2020 highly cited scientists. He has more than 32 career awards, including the prestigious Margolis Brain Disorders Prize and the Colvin Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Mood Disorders. BRAINCAST people, this is Professor Gustavo Turecki. Prof, welcome to BRAINCAST.
Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. It's pretty early there, and thank you for making the time to join us today. Prof, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the most devastating experiences for anyone to have is contemplating taking their own lives. And, but despite that, society response hasn't always been that sympathetic, if you like. And the sad truth about suicide is that it's way more common than we would have liked it to be. With the World Health Organization reporting something like 800,000 people dying by suicide each year worldwide. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Of course, not everyone is affected the same. And this is something we will be exploring in the next few questions. So let's start with what many people call the suicide paradox. That while women are more likely to experience suicidal thoughts, men are much more likely to take their own lives, which I have to say has led many to falsely underestimate not only the risk, but also the impact suicidal ideation may have on one's well-being, particularly the females. So is that suicide paradox true?
Yes, so generally it is. And you see in most of the countries, you see a difference in the way, as you presented, that women attempt more suicide, whereas men die more by suicide. There are exceptions, though, to this, and these are notable exceptions, such as rural China and some parts of India, where the more women also die by suicide. And now it has shifted a little bit in China as it developed. And the way we understood why it happened was that typically women do attempt more suicide than men, but in those areas access to services was more difficult and the means of attempt was more lethal, so women tended to die more by suicide. How can we explain this paradox? It's although we don't understand it fully, but I think the most clear hypothesis is that men in general tend to use more lethal means, yes, than women when they attempt suicide, yes, so that it leads to more deaths than women.
Undoubtedly, Prof, there are links between, mental health disorders and suicide, from ADHD to depression and psychosis. But as you point out in your 2020 Nature Reviews primer, and I quote, although suicide is not an inevitable outcome of any psychiatric disease, specific features of individual diseases are associated with suicide. So what are these?
Yes, so clearly, yes, there's mental illness is the most strongest predictor of suicide, in the sense that most of the people who die by suicide, if not all, were affected by a mental illness. Now, most of the people who have mental illness do not die by suicide yet. So the issue is who among the people who are affected. So let's take depression, for instance. You know, who among the people who have depression would die by suicide? Yes. So there are certain features that help us understand risk, yes, of suicide among individuals of one particular psychopathology. So these are levels of impulsivity, yes, and aggressive behavior. So impulsive aggressive behaviors are very strong predictors of suicide among individuals who are depressed, as well as hopelessness. Yes, is one important characteristic of the individual, let's say, of the depressive episode, that help us understand suicide risk. There are a number of other ones that have more to do with the individual per se. So let's say a family history of suicidal behaviors. So in general, you have certain risk factors, yes, that help us understand risk, but we cannot do it, you know, systematically and understand person by person.
And suicide attempts have also been associated with the use of substances such as drugs and alcohol, and that has been the case in many observational studies. And then here you are suggesting that there is that this association between substances and suicide attempts is indeed causal. So tell me more.
Well, causal, it depends how you have to be careful when you say causal. I think that substance use is an important risk factor. The way we understand that is that substance use disinhibits, yes, behavior. So, so if you are, let's say, in an episode of depression, with depression, you would have typically suicidal ideation. Yeah, suicidal ideation is to some extent, you know, part of the natural history of depression, and then you have suicidal ideation, and then you are more impulsive aggressive in general, and then you use substance, and substance disinhibit this impulsive aggression, so you're more likely to act on the suicidal thoughts. So that's somewhat of the model in which we understand the use, you know, the comorbidity between substance and depression, leading to an increased risk of suicide.
And so we touched on, you know, sex differences, you know, the impact of ill mental health and drugs. We do know, though, that variation in suicide also exists between countries, to some extent, also reflecting the impact of culture. So Greece, for example, has had traditionally extremely low suicide rates, something that rapidly changed after the recession. And a recent research letter by Paul Mestad looking into suicide mortality trends in Maryland in the States during this pandemic. So he showed an increase in suicides in Black individuals that also happened to be poor. And you also recently co-authored the paper published at JAMA Network Open showing how leveraging social support can improve outcomes in adolescents, including suicide-related outcomes. So the question is, do you think that the poor and socially disadvantaged are disproportionately affected by suicide?
Well, look, I think first, you know, you have to understand that, you know, there are a number of different factors that play a role. So clearly, poverty associates with a number of negative mental health outcomes. Yes, so suicide is not an exception. What you said about, you know, geographic variation and variations in suicide rates, you have to understand that yes, there is variability that it's mostly attributed to time and socio-demographic variabilities, between societies. Yes, so you have as well. There's nothing innate to a particular group that makes it more predisposed to suicide, as far as we understand. But risk factors change over time. Yes, and change geographically, and that's what determines variability between communities, including socio-demographic factors and poverty. Yes, so with with poverty, we have a decrease in social cohesion, or decrease on protector, on social protecting factors. In some, it depends also in countries to countries. You have different social supports, and even within particular regions, you would have this variability. Yes, so let's say you talk about Greece and other countries, which even within a country, yes, you would have variabilities within regions. Yes, so and then you would have regions that have much higher rates of suicide, whereas other regions that have lower rates of suicide. So it is difficult to compare countries per se. Yes, you have national rates, but then you have these differences. So even, for instance, here in Canada, we have in the north, in the northern communities, we have rates that are 10 times higher than the national average. Yes, so there is a lot of variability. The variability has to do with modifiable variable risk factors for suicide, that change over time. And there's nothing related to individual risk factors.
In one of your most iconic papers for The Lancet, it was cited nearly 1,000 times, you essentially consolidated what you call the stress diathesis approach of suicide. So can you tell me a bit more about this?
Yes. So that it's a way to understand individual suicide risk. Yes. So you would have individuals have a certain diathesis, a certain predisposition, yes, that it's given by who they are. Yes, so we are all made by a genetic makeup, and then we go through life and have life experiences that would interact with our genome and modify the genome, and then that makes us who we are. Yes, so that is the individual predisposition. Yes, and then you have events that occur in the life of the person and that interact with this individual predisposition. Yes, so that's the stress diathesis model, if you wish. Yes, the diathesis it's made of all of these genetic and factors plus the modifications of the experience through epigenetic factors. Yes, and then you have events that occur. So let's say you are exposed to a breakup, or you lose all your your means, or you were humiliated socially and publicly. So these are events that would trigger in many people, depressive episodes. And then in some people, these depressive episodes will lead to a suicide. Yes, and why is because we believe that these people have particular predisposing factors.
Now, Prof, you have researched for many years one of the, let's say, less talked about side of suicide, the biological substrate. So you co-authored the Frontiers paper published this February, whereby using a post-mortem approach, you showed there is a clear astrocytic dysfunction in depressed suicides. And on a similar note, in a fascinating 2020 molecular psychiatry paper, you showed how a novel, long, non-coding RNA is involved in the regulation of aggressive, impulsive behaviors that in turn strongly predicts lifetime suicide behavior. So how are you hoping to use this information? How can you jump from astrocytes and long non-coding RNAs to actually suicide.
Yeah. So look, I think we need to understand exactly what's going on in the brain of individuals who are depressed and think about suicide. And there's only one way of understanding is by investigating the brains and trying to trying to dissect and understand at the molecular level. I mean, that's my approach. There are other approaches as well that are valid, but my particular interest is trying to understand what happens at the molecular level. So when you do that, well, you need to understand exactly what is the diathesis, yes, and what are the stressors. So, the approach of my lab has been, in two ways. So first, we have focused on the impact of early life adversity, yes, because early life adversity is an important predictor of lifetime suicide risk, yes. So, and I think that we all can relate to that, even clinically, to see how individuals who went through significant early life stressors, yes, have a hard time regulating their emotions and behaviors, later on. And that, so we have been trying to understand, okay, so what happens with these individuals? So what changes occur in the brain as a result of the exposure to early life adversity? Yes. So, we have taken the approach of trying to understand adaptations that occur, because we believe that individuals who are exposed to life adversity early on in life, and at a period in which the brain is very plastic and adapting to environmental experience, the so-called critical periods, the brain adapts and adjusts to better respond to that particular environment. And then there are a number of processes that occur at the molecular level. So, these processes that collectively are referred to as epigenetics, yes, so would modify, at the molecular level, brain cells, yes. So we have investigated the changes that occur in these brain cells at the molecular, at specific epigenetic changes, like methylation, for instance, yes. And then have taken different approaches at looking at other molecular changes that occur, such as long non-coding RNAs. Yes. So, obviously we won't have time to get into details of this.
Yeah, of course.
But long non-coding RNAs are a part of the machinery in the cells that help cells adjust and function, and these are long, as the name says, long pieces of RNA that do not code to proteins but have a regulatory function. So in this particular case, we identified a long non-coding RNA that it's almost 8 kbs, so it's very long. It's intergenic, so in other words, it's not intra a gene. It's coded in between two genes, and was placed between the two genes that code for monoamine oxidase and that regulate one of the monoamine oxidase genes. Yes, and we've shown that this long non-coding RNA it regulates impulsive aggressive behaviors. Yes, okay. So I told you before that impulsive aggressive behaviors are risk factors for suicide. So what we've shown is that this long non-coding RNA, it's increased in individuals who die by suicide with histories of early life adversity, and that and then explains, at least in animal models that we have done, explains increased impulsive aggressive behaviors. So this could be one possible molecular mechanism that would lead to this. So, you know, the astrocytes, it's another example of other molecular ways, you know, to understand depressive and suicidal behavior. So, you know, the brain is complex. They're not only neurons. All the cells have a role, and astrocytes are fascinating cells, you know, that help as well the brain function. And so we have also identified some results that suggest that there is a dysregulation of astrocytes in depression and suicide.
But let's get a bit more clinical. You know, approximately 45% of individuals who die by suicide consult a primary care physician within 1 month of death. So either we're doing something totally wrong, or suicide risk is indeed incredibly difficult to predict, or maybe both. So what's happening, you think?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both, yes. So I don't think we do something wrong deliberately. I just think that, you know, this data that you said, you know, it's in, you know, in general primary care settings, yes. So often, you know, in primary care settings, you know, people don't get asked certain questions, yes, so they don't talk about them. And so that's basically what these data suggest. I think, you know, we have been doing a little bit better probably now. I mean, there has been a lot of programs to educate primary care clinicians about the importance of asking questions. And I think that, you know, there has been somewhat of an improvement. But if you think that, you know, in some places, the primary care appointment lasts for, let's say, 10 minutes or so, yes, it is, you know, it is difficult for the primary care clinician to cover everything. You know, the chief complaint for which, you know, the person came to see, and plus ask questions about other things. So maybe we're missing there some people at risk. I think that, so that's the part maybe that we're doing, that we could do better, let's say, let's put it this way. And then the other part is that, you know, suicide ideation fluctuates. People not always want to disclose or talk about it. Yes, some, you know, for some patients, you know, some people have difficulties talking about their emotions, or talking about, particularly, you know, if you talk in general in primary care, you know, and also males, young males, you know, who are at risk of suicide and die. So there are, you know, I think that the approach that we have is not always ideal, and then so at that level, there is room for improvement. Now, do we know exactly how? No, we don't.
And of course, you know, the most important question is, what do we do after we establish that someone is at risk for attempting suicide? And while I'm way far from suggesting that, you know, a pill will solve the situation, I was really intrigued to read Keith Houghton's systematic review and meta-analysis of ketamine for suicidal ideation in adults with psychiatric disorders. So what they suggest is that a single infusion of ketamine may have a short-term, up to 72 hours, beneficial impact on suicidal thoughts. So are there robust pharmacological options, or do you think we have, you know, over-relied on these pharmacological options over the years?
Yeah, no, so we don't have, I mean, we do have robust pharmacological options collectively, yes, but we don't have specific pharmacological options to address suicidal ideation, yes. Ketamine is one example. I mean, it's not specific for suicidal ideation. It does act on suicidal ideation, but not only on that, yes. So you can say the same for all the other medications that we have, which are collectively, I think, efficient, but are not necessarily specific, you know, for suicidal ideation. So ketamine, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about this because, if you are in the context, let's say, of an emergency, yes, an emergency room, and you are seeing a patient that comes to the emergency room and it's suicidal, and then, typically what would you do? What you would do is that you would keep the patient, and if it's someone that you're very concerned, you put the patient on constant care, yes, and you would treat the suicidal crisis. I mean, I'm talking in general because obviously it depends on the case by case and the nature of the suicide crisis. But in general, if you're concerned, so you're going to keep the patient hospitalized and then on constant care until the suicidal crisis, the episode, it's treated. That may take several days or weeks, yes, and maybe a month. So, by using ketamine, if the suicidal ideation improves and the suicidal crisis can be dealt more effective. So there's obviously tremendous advantages about this. So there is a lot of enthusiasm in the use of ketamine to treat suicidal episodes, crisis per se.
And Prof, what would a BRAINCAST be without COVID? So based on the fact that suicide rates in the US have been rising over the last 2 decades, Mark Greger wrote a viewpoint published at JAMA Psychiatry titled Suicide Mortality and Coronavirus Disease 2019, a Perfect Storm. And on the other hand, I was reading Professor Louis Appleby's viewpoint at BMJ, and it seems that, we need to be a bit more cautious in our estimates. So what do you think was the pandemic impact on suicide, or is it too early to say?
Yeah, I think we have to be more cautious, in how we make estimates about the impact. So I think it's early to know for sure what the effect, what the total effect of the pandemic will be. What we know, for instance, is in the first phase of the pandemic, so the first few months until June, let's say last year, what we saw was actually a reduction of suicide rates. Pretty much in many of the places. There's an interesting paper by Jane Perkins published recently in Lancet Psychiatry, showing precisely that in the first months of the pandemic, suicide rates actually went down. Yet, so it is possible to think about this because the first months of the pandemic, people was a general crisis, normalized isolation, normalized a lot of things. It was a lot of support, in many respects. So maybe that contributed to a reduce in suicide rates. But but we don't know yet. We don't have data yet, as far as I'm aware, for after the second and third phases of the pandemic. So it's as if you think about the impact, at least here in my environment, the first phase of the pandemic was associated with a significant decrease in patients in going to hospitals, emergencies, etc. But then after that, everything normalized. So we'll see. We'll see exactly how they come.
Last question. We have only 40 seconds. So inspired by the pandemic, Professor David said in his blog for UCL that there is no vaccine for suicide, but there are some ways to increase immunity. So what are these ways in your opinion?
Well, look, it would take like an hour to answer that question.
40 seconds, that's
basically, it's all of the above. So I think that what we need to do is basically, improve prevention. Yes, we have to improve access to treatment to people who are at risk. Yes, and significantly invest on research on suicide. To better understand exactly suicide, what would develop more specific interventions. Yeah. And better do the jobs that basically right now we have a hard time doing.
Fantastic. BRAINCAST people, Professor Gustavo Turecki. We've only scratched the surface of a massive iceberg of research on suicide, and even if you hadn't listened to a word of all the things we've been talking about the last 30 minutes, do yourself a favor and read his excellent paper in Nature Reviews, published in 2019, titled Suicide and Suicide Risk. You can thank me later. In the meantime, I will remain overseas as I take the first flight from Montreal to Boston, where I find Professor Silberman. The reason? So Professor Silberman published a paper at the British Journal of Psychiatry a few months back, and instead of thanks and invitations, for interviews, he received death threats. Its topic, benzodiazepines, which happens to be what we will be discussing next Monday. Until then, Pospo and BRAINCAST for Monday Learning, over and out.